Welcome everyone to the second of our GWPF podcasts, where we talk about a variety of things that come to mind about what's happened in climate science and climate discussion in general over the past month or so. And with me is Dr. Benny Peiser, Director of the Global Warming Policy Foundation. And the first thing that I think that struck both of us, Benny, was the just released Royal Society report of how things have changed since the last IPCC report.
Yeah. It's much worse than we thought.
Oh, it is?
It's much worse. And you know, the IPCC, they are these kind of conservative deniers who basically deny all the threats we face.
It was interesting, the last IPCC report was criticised for not being extremist enough, not being alarmist enough.
Yes, well, it's a basically government-run show of skeptics who underestimate all the threats we're facing by climate change. But if you believe the claims in the latest paper by the Royal Society.
So they're putting it right. They're giving us their authoritative view of what's changed. And, well, as you said, it appears it's much worse.
It's much worse. It's always much worse. It's never, ever, or it's perhaps not as bad as we thought. Did you notice that? You never, ever hear any climate scientist saying, oh, you know what? It's not as bad as we thought because, you know, the temperatures aren't rising as fast as we thought, or the Arctic isn't as melting as fast as we thought.
Well, even that paper a few weeks ago when a group of scientists said that we haven't released as much carbon in the atmosphere as we thought. Therefore, it might be easier to reduce it, given the fact we haven't put as much in the atmosphere. That paper had a barrage of criticism from people who said that it was misrepresenting, it was far too lenient, and the situation was far worse than that, even though their figures were actually very interesting.
Yes. Well, this is the problem, that any paper that comes out on the more or less alarming side of the argument will be criticized for playing into the hands of skeptics. And so moderates have a hard life in climate science. Moderates have a very hard life because they are regarded as hidden allies of the skeptics.
Reminds me of, I think it was, who was it? It was some Labour politician had to give a speech introducing Tony Blair or something when he'd just become Prime Minister. And he said he thought Tony Blair was wonderful, the best thing since sliced bread, magnificent. And then he added, although I realise that in some quarters, this is regarded as a suspiciously lukewarm endorsement. It seems to me that if you try and bring in some scientific reality and actually don't say it's as bad as bad can be, you are suspiciously lukewarm.
Yes, indeed. And unfortunately, this latest paper by the Royal Society falls into this category in that they basically just look at research findings that cherry pick, essentially, research findings that are on the worse than we thought category.
Well, I read with particular interest, a thing which is of a special interest to me, is the pause. Is this suggestion that in the last 20 years or so, surface temperature has not increased as much as was predicted. And is that or is that not consistent with the models? And they actually have a section in this called Was There a Pause? Which is curious indeed that after 10 years or more of discussion about this, and numerous papers flagged up in the media saying there was no pause, it never existed. There is a section in the report which actually discusses was there a pause. And I have to say, and you know, it's very difficult to criticise the Royal Society. There are an august bunch of many excellent scientists, one of the world's premier collections of experts. I have to say, on this, I don't agree. Humble me does not agree with some of this analysis. They say that the pause has been largely explained as due to internal variability. And that seen, as I say, quote, seen in the context of the most recent years, the multi-decadal trend overwhelms the short-term variability. Well, I'm sorry, but it doesn't. They make great play of the last couple of years, which have been warm due to an El Nino. Now, they are an aberration. That is weather. That is not part of the pause. If you look over the past 20 years, without that El Nino, that weather-related event, the pause is obvious and is not overwhelmed by longer decadal variability. In fact, you can go back, and some people do, go back to the start of the recent warming spell, which is about 1979, and draw a straight line between that point and the latest data point. And you can almost convince yourself that what you see are wiggles either side of that line. But that's not the whole story. There is an excellent case to be made that that straight line, if you projected it up after around about 2000, the data falls below that line. And I think there are a lot of people who agree with that, and that is unacknowledged in this section of the report. They do not realise, or they don't acknowledge even the Met Office of last January, which said that the recent El Ninos added about 0.2 of a degree to the temperature. You take that off those El Ninos, and you see the pause. Yeah. The pause is actually obvious. Yeah. And I think this...
And it's a gamble as well,
yes,
because for all we know, temperatures have been coming down since the peak of the El Nino, and no one knows, how far they will come down. For all we know, it might be back to the pause in 3-4 months. Who knows?
Who knows? I mean, we know the El Nino has ended, but there is a lot of energy around and heat around from the El Nino that is still in the system and hasn't been taken away by a La Nina yet. So we are still in a very warm year. But as you say, there are signs of a La Nina coming, and that may dissipate this energy, may reduce the temperature, and render this section of the report null and void in just a few months. But they do end it, actually, with, I think, a really political, interesting quote. They say, in the future, now, we've talked a lot in the past about, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, so whenever you make a statement about the future, you are really a hostage to fortune, particularly in Earth's surface temperature. It says, in the future, the rate of surface warming is expected to continue to exhibit year-to-year and decadal-to-decadal variability, in addition to a long-term trend. Well, we shall see. In 5 years' time, if we still have the year-to-year variability, and then in 10 years' time, we still see this variability, but there's no long-term trend. If you can look at a year and say, that year is statistically the same as one of the early years of this century, where is the long-term trend? That is interesting. If we've seen 20 years of this pause, internal variability, some natural effect might be suppressing the long-term trend, but sooner or later, when is it we say the long-term trend is coming? And when do we say, well, where has it gone?
Yes, indeed. And that brings me to their chapter on the climate sensitivity, where they are basically saying new evidence suggests that the IPCC is no longer valid. They have this range from 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius for a doubling of CO2. And they essentially are saying new evidence suggests that this is all far too lukewarm, and they think that any value below 2 degrees Celsius is unlikely for the range of equilibrium climate sensitivity. In other words, they are suggesting that the next IPCC report should basically push up the range of warming. But this is based not on historical data. They're essentially saying historical data is less reliable than their models. They're saying climate sensitivity derived from historical data gives an underestimate of the value for high carbon dioxide atmospheres. So they don't even trust historical data, but the historical data is our most important basis, much more than the modeling, for estimating how much warming to expect. And the warming since World War II, when the IPCC claims that man-made anthropogenic global warming kicked in, up to today, is only about 0.1 degree per decade.
Mhm.
So if that is the range over the last 70 years or so, and there's no real sense of acceleration, why would we expect so much more warming than what we've actually seen in
Yes.
the past?
Yes, and they elsewhere in the report, they talk about the so-called disparity between models and data in surface temperature. And they say that's been largely reconciled. Well, I'm sorry, but it hasn't.
No, it
It's
hasn't.
reconciled if you add in the El Nino of the past few years, which makes the models look better. But that's a weather event. And the impression I got was that before this recent El Nino, the mood was generally to say, well, okay, the models are running hot. There was no great expression of that, but that was the way I got the drift of the scientific community was going. This recent El Nino has changed that. They've sort of slid back a bit because that El Nino tick up in the temperature makes the models look good, but it doesn't actually. It just emphasizes the fact that the climate models run far too hot.
Yeah. Indeed.
And I don't think that is acknowledged in this report. And I think there was a piece in The Guardian recently, surprisingly enough, that caught your fancy.
Yes, well, occasionally, very, very rarely, there is a piece in The Guardian that is not in the mood of it's worse than we thought, but more in the mood of hold on, it's perhaps not as dramatic as some scientists claim.
I think we ought to stop the podcast here. This
Yes.
is clearly a remarkable event, but do carry on.
So Tamsin Edwards, a very respected British climate scientist, responded to a kind of apocalyptic article by an American scientist who wrote about the ice apocalypse and the kind of meltdown of the ice caps and the Antarctic ice cliff instability and the kind of disasters that would follow if the Antarctic ice cliff were basically to hit us. And she rightly points out that although there is evidence for warming and melting, particularly in the kind of West Antarctic ice sheet, and some evidence that parts of that ice sheet is unstable, the evidence for apocalypse is simply not there, and we should be a little bit less hysterical about these and look at the full spectrum of evidence. And I thought, why don't we have more articles like that try to balance the scientific evidence and the observational evidence in a way that isn't always hysterical and always screaming the end is nigh? I think we should really encourage scientists to be more balanced and to really report the full spectrum of the scientific debate. I mean, Tamsin accurately points out, and she says there is little consensus in the scientific community about this so-called ice cliff instability and what it might do in the future. And she rightly points out that there is a debate, as on so many other issues. You rarely hear the full spectrum of views within the science community. I think it undermines their credibility. and all credit for pointing out that the debate is still ongoing on this issue.
Do you know, I think Twitter makes this worse, because Twitter forces a handful of influencers in the climate debate who are extreme to summarize their extreme views, unbalanced assessment of the current scientific situation in a small section which appeals to tribes, which creates the false impression of the progress of science. So I think there are a handful, 20 or so, people on Twitter who don't do that, who don't give you the nuances. I mean, this is the Earth, for heaven's sake. This is a complex sheet of ice in a very interesting part of the world. It's not simple. It's not terribly clear-cut unless you want to make it so. And I think what Tamsin has done there is has said that this is more complicated. This is proper science. And we've been doing it on the website for quite a while. We've been saying this, and we've been pointing out the media's and some scientists' view of one paper. And we've been saying, hang on, you can look at it a different way. And if that's in The Guardian, then that's really good.
Yeah,
we should encourage this.
Yeah, it's a good sign. And interestingly enough, on this very topic of the ice sheet's instability and the West Antarctic ice sheet, there's a new research paper coming out from NASA researchers suggesting that much of it might actually to do with volcanic activity under the Western Arctic ice sheet, nothing to do with climate change. Who knows? They say that there is a mantle plume deep below the Antarctic Maria Bird land that may explain the melting of that particular part of the Antarctic.
And it has been a mantra in recent years that Antarctica is not changing very much, except for this region. This is the one region where the climate is changing.
Yes.
And it has been, if you like, an icon of climate change and the disastrous effects it could have on all of us. Well, this paper is fascinating because it doesn't say that nothing is happening. It just says the cause is not what we expected. The cause is not climate change. The cause is one of these mantle plumes which brings up great amount of heat from deep in the earth up to beneath the crust. And although that could cause us environmental problems in the future, it's entirely independent of anything we've done. It's not
very little you can do about it.
We'll have to cope with it.
Yes.
So this shows that not every adverse climatic event we're going to face on the earth is down to us. This is nature, and it's been interpreted wrongly. That's an object lesson because science is progressive. The observations are gold standard. The interpretation can change, and West Antarctica seems to be a case in point.